Me and my partner Lucy were just talking about this today because she's facing, she's going to finish law school and she's going to have to deal with character and fitness, right? So we are also always facing someone telling us whether we are fit or whether we are credible, right? And that's really where the title of this book comes from, correct? Who would believe a prisoner? We are constantly in the media having to be discredited by being labeled, even though we are the closest to the situation, we are the closest to the problems, right? How did this title come about, and what was it like to find that this original account that you guys had found was also written by a person who was incarcerated?
Right, right. So Harry Banca was an incarcerated man in Jeffersonville prison. He was a clerk, like we've all been clerks,
back in the mid-19th century.
Back in the mid-19th century, and because they expect so little of us and don't really remark or think we have much capacity, they gave him wide access to all the files in the administration building as a clerk. And he began to do his research, writing his notes on brown paper bags and taking them back to the cell and writing it up officially. And as soon as he got out of prison, he published a book. And that book, most scholars on Indiana history don't cite him. But we chose to privilege his account as a person who lived in the prison when all of this went down, and lift him up as an authoritative reporting source. And so he is telling the story about Ava Green. She was given syphilis from a steward in the prison who the warden allowed to have, open access to the women in the facility. And she ended up with lesions all over her body. Well, she took that to the board of directors of the prison as essentially a court hearing. And she brought her testimony. And, the steward shook his head, like he put his head down because he knew he was guilty. But when it was time for her to bring additional witnesses, other incarcerated women in Jeffersonville at the time who saw it all go down, the Colonel Merriweather, who was serving as his own steward's representative, just messy, he said, oh no, we can't have them talk. We can't have this woman talk. She's always lying. We don't caught them all in a bunch of lies. Besides, who would believe them anyway? And that idea about besides who would believe a prisoner comes from that. From that moment when this man was saying, we don't listen to their testimony. You should automatically not believe them, right? And it plays a double role because as incarcerated women who happen to be incarcerated doing this work, we were dealing with the double disqualification of us as scholars doing this research, but then also telling the stories of the women who had also been discounted. So that double disqualification is kind of why the title kind of is working in two ways. Mm-hmm. Who would believe us? Who would believe them?
And I would also say, one of the things that we've had to navigate as a group, there's a lot of choices behind the format of that book, because it's the new press, which is a popular press, but we wanted to have the whole academic, the footnotes and everything, all the receipts in there, and to have it work on that academic register. But it wasn't that there was a lot of tension, I think, about that, or productive tension, because it's like, in order for you all to have your voices be seen as credible, being able to speak in that academic register gave your words validity, but why did it have to be translated into that mode? Mm-hmm. But you've done work in so many other modes as well, creative formats and everything else. But just the kind of the negotiation with academic language and academic standards and evidence and all of that kind of thing was strategic ultimately. Yeah. But this is one product, but then there's the play and all these other creative projects that you all have done.
Yeah, I am probably one of the main people in this group from the very beginning that's like fuck the institution. And I don't care what institution I'm talking about. Fuck the institution. I had been publishing things I had written in free anarchist publications for years before we got on this. So I have fought since the beginning, like, sure, let's do the scholarly stuff, let's do the academic stuff, but the ivory tower is part of the problem. We need to dismantle that too. You know, so how do we put something out like Dr. Nelson is saying? How do we almost attempt to try to force us as being credible, and the academic lens, the scholarly lens was sort of the way to do that. But how do we also produce work that any human being anywhere can now access the knowledge that we've uncovered? Because I believe what we uncovered, everybody needs to be able to access that. And I mean, one of the things that we knew, and this is part of why we're privileging our information, our lives so much were paralleling in the prison in the 21st century what these women were experiencing in the 19th century. It is the same story over and over and over again, and it's the fact that people have gatekept that knowledge, suppressed the truth of things, suppressed voices, silenced women, discounted women and people, that in order to get a clear understanding of how and why we currently have the problems with mass incarceration, you need to be able to understand the truth of what happened in the beginning and why. Because it is the same damn story, but it's all that has been silenced and hidden and suppressed that has allowed this to grow into the animal it now is. So, you know, I think now it's such a massive problem, and so many people are affected by it in some way, shape, or form. People trying to figure out how in the hell did this happen. Well, you can't understand how it happened if the history you know has been a lie all along. And it's been about power and control since the very beginning. So it's starting to untangle that power structure, dismantle power as it's been, and particularly in knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge.
Yeah. And I love that, and because I'm thinking about the fact that there are no Indiana historians, high or low, that write about this work. And there are several African American women historians of Indiana history that I appreciate, but they did not write about carcerality, impact in the carceral state, or women's experience in the carceral state, because those historians at that time were so much focused on Black forward, upward mobility. They were telling that message about Strivers Row and Black people organizing, creating clubs, and Black uplift, that it was not part of their plan, if you will, is to talk about those who are also impacted by the carceral state, right? So,
I do want to give like a bit of a trigger warning that some of the material in this book is like super heavy. Like, we're talking about sexual abuse, medical experimentation, and you really got into that in your chapter, Anastazia, on like the medical side of things. And I was struck by how you said this story also reveals the overlap between slavery and incarceration, often wrongly considered autonomous institutions with separate histories. This is something that comes up a lot when we're talking about prison labor, right? And people are saying, yeah, there's actually a difference between this and chattel slavery. I hadn't thought about this until I read this book, that this is another thing that was repeated in prisons, right? Because you talk about an earlier man who's considered like the father of modern gynecology or whatever, who was experimenting on enslaved women. And then I'm curious, you know, because this was supposed to be a, like you said, like sort of like a shining pamphlet about the founders of this prison.
The story of the year.
Yeah, like as women who were experiencing all of the like, you know, current oppression of like what medical treatment is in prison, right, or the lack thereof, right? How did you start thinking about what was actually going on here? I know at some point you realized, right, that there was like the president of the American Medical Association was working at the prison, and I imagine it must have been like, why was he working in a prison?
Yes, that was exactly. Chelsea came in so excited, like, oh, Anna, you're gonna be thrilled to learn this. Dr. Pervin was the president of the AMA. Like, isn't that amazing? He was working here. And my response was literally, Fuck no, it's not amazing. Why would the president of the AMA work in a women's prison in Backwater, Indiana, if but not to further his own career? And we went back and forth and back and forth. I mean, over weeks, back and forth. We were literally inches from each other's face, toe to toe one day, arguing about this because she just was convinced that my theories were so far-fetched and so ludicrous, and it finally comes to a head where she's screaming, Anna, how do you know? How do you know? You keep saying you know. How do you know? I said, I know because I am that fucking woman. I know because of what they did to me. So the bane of my research in this book really begins with my own story and what they had done to me. I was given 15 of the strongest psychotropic medications on the planet in dosage levels that are way higher than any person should be on, in combinations that are contraindicated. If I had not been pulled off that dope when I literally would have died. By the time they brought me to, and they put me on trial this way, people, I went through a trial in a state that's known as chemical restraint, which is basically a drug-induced lobotomy. So I don't even know what the hell had happened to me by the time I come into the prison. So if I can give the prison credit for anything, amen, that they said, hell no, you're not getting these narcotics in here, and threw them in the trash. And I start coming back to some semblance of cognizant awareness of what in the hell happened. On top of that, being incarcerated in jail, awaiting trial, all through trial and sentencing in that state, I had very little to any recollection of what had actually happened during that time frame. So every piece of information I was getting about my own trial is coming third party. It took me 13 years of fighting to finally obtain my own trial transcripts. Crazy, because at the point in time that it's finally relinquished to me, it's too damn late. I had already exceeded every level of state remedy and been denied at every level, and had missed the statute of limitations to be able to file in the federal court. So by the time my shit is relinquished to me, it's pretty much, oh well, you're serving 55 years, there's not shit you can do about it. And this is where I joke now, saying, that's where you guys can label me crazy, because I said fuck you and I filed anyway, and I'm sitting in front of you today because I did that. It is my own lived experience of what they had done to me medically, repeatedly, over the course of the years, what they had withheld from me, what the court had withheld from the court, from the jury, from the public record. All of this is what informed me in the work. So when I'm looking at the documents in the prison and I'm seeing things that don't match, and I'm seeing what I like to call holes of information, it was the exact same thing that I saw in my own records when I finally had obtained them. This record does not match that record. You're getting multiple different stories, and the crux of what's actually happening, there's no thread putting any of it together. So there would be no way for somebody else to really connect the dots. And this is what informed every piece of what I ended up doing. And the fact that in those years, starting to try to, I didn't know nothing about law, didn't want to know anything about law, didn't have a choice, had to start learning law to fight for myself. It was other women then coming to me with their records and their cases, and what I saw was a parallel story. And I tell people now, thousands of women I helped with legal situations over the years, I have never seen a quote rightful conviction. It has been a violation of law and due process of law in every single case I looked at in order to get those convictions. So that's caused me to say, who is rightfully in prison right now? Anybody? Are you actually following the law in order to get those convictions? No, they aren't. So who is rightfully in prison? I'm yet to find one.